Good morning, everybody. I would like first to thank the organizers of this colloquium, especially this workshop, especially my friend and colleague, Professor Stroumsa, who has invited me to this conference, and also to chair this specific session. This is an occasion for me to learn about Africa. I myself was born in Africa, in the northwest part of the continent. There are two there from this part of Africa, and she also took care to give me the occasion to have a compatriot with whom I can practice a little bit our common Arabic dialect of Morocco. So thank you very much, Sarah, for this occasion. And I will switch to the subject itself. I'm very much pleased to invite Professor Mehdi Ghouirgate. Please. So let me first tell you that one of our speakers, Professor Judith Osvis Schlenger, will not be with us. I don't know the reason why she will not be here, but she will not be. So the time is divided between two of you, so we can speak a bit longer, but not too longer, in order to finish our session at 1 o'clock. So I will introduce briefly Professor Mehdi Ghouirgate. Mehdi Ghouirgate is a professor at Bordeaux-Montaigne University and affiliated also with the University Mohammed VI in Faculté de Gouvernance, Sciences économiques et sociales in Rabat. He holds a... Sorry, I have to change my glasses. Professor Mehdi Ghouirgate holds he specializes in the history of the Muslim West, Maghreb and Al-Andalus in the medieval and modern periods. He is committed to revisiting this history using a resolutely multidisciplinary approach that draws on anthropology, economics, demography, and the history of languages in their diachronic dimensions, starting with the Berbers. He is also the author of numerous books and articles published in international journals, mainly in French, but also in English and in Spanish. Among the books, there is a long list. I will just mention here 3 books. The first of them was published in 2020, is L'Ordre Almohad, une nouvelle lecture anthropologique. The second, Les Empires berbères, construction et déconstruction d'un objet historiographique, that was published last year. Another book that was published last year is a monography entitled Ibn Khaldoun, itinéraire d'un penseur maghrébin. So these are just 3 among his many other publications. He will be talking to us this morning on the following subject, the Almoravid and Almohad Berber Dynasties, 11th to 13th century, an African perspective. Please, Mehdi.
Boker Tov, Sabah al-Khair, Azul Filaoun. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for having me today. It's a great pleasure to share this moment with you. And especially, I want to say thank you to Sarah Stroumsa and François-Xavier Fauvelle set up that kind of event. Today, I'm going to talk about the relationships between North Africa and the Bilad Sudan, which means the land of the black people, which is the western part of Africa in the medieval ages. First of all, I have to clarify things. It is that today I will speak mainly about the human dimensions of these relations between these two civilizational entities. First of all, there is among the scholars who have dedicated themselves to this subject a form of eagerness to quickly compare the medieval trade with the modern Atlantic trade. It seems that after all, they want to draw a comparison with the triangular trade and especially with slavery in the United States. It's a real problem because studying this ancient period in the Middle Ages is, as the great Jules Michelet in the 19th century would have said, going on a distant journey. This requires knowing medieval Arabic sources, but also Berber, which was the language spoken by the majority of the population, which can make it possible to distinguish between cultural exchanges as well as the categories of perception of space and time of the inhabitants of North Africa. Moreover, the Maghreb constitutes an extremely particular civilizational entity, very different from Al-Andalus and Egypt. The first peculiarity of the Maghreb is that since the Great Revolt of 740, the Central and Western Maghreb has been independent of the Eastern Caliphates. Indeed, my working hypothesis is that one of the particularities of the history of the Maghreb is that from the Fatimid period, I mean the 9th century, until the Berber Empire, I mean Almoravids and the Almohads, since the 11th century to the 14th centuries, the Maghreb constantly received a significant contribution from the black population, mainly civil at the origin. At this point, there is another big problem. The prevalence of the Al-Andalus history in Europe since the Romantic period and the discovery of Al-Alhambra by Washington Irving. Most of the French and Spanish scholars who studied the Maghreb history were originally specialized in the Al-Andalus history. Therefore, they pay little attention to relations between the Maghreb and the sub-Saharan Africa. This is extremely regrettable since these relations were crucial. Indeed, the Maghreb became the seat of caliphate exactly at the time when commercial and human relations were increasing between North Africa and Bilad Sudan in the first half of the 9th century. The constitution of a specific objet historiographique, the Mediterranean world, in particular with Fernand Braudel, largely left this question aside. That is to say, the connection of sub-Saharan Africa with the Maghreb, the Mediterranean, and Europe. It is striking to note a geographer like al-Bakri, Abu Ubaid al-Bakri, was never left Al-Andalus, is able to write pages and pages of description of the Bilad Sudan. He seemed, in fact, very well informed. After the 3 centuries of exchanges for an Egyptian such as Al-Umari in the 14th century, the Maghreb and the Bilad Sudan form a single entity. In relation to antiquity, something very important, and nothing more and nothing less than crucial, had happened. The exit from the historical anonymity of West Africa. It seems that the economic and demographic start of the Christian West is related to this increased trade with the Bilad Sudan. It is the trade in gold and slave, which is the primary cause of the end of historical anonymity of West Africa. On the other hand, as we will see, gold played a major role in these exchanges. We can think that the Renaissance of the Mediterranean as a place of exchanges with very populated port as Almeria or Valencia is a consequence of these exchanges. It is a fact that the 2 Caliph dynasty, Fatimid and Umayyad, struck gold coins during the 9th century, and both dynasties fought to dominate the gold trade. First, the emergence of strong power north and south of the Sahara, the Almoravids and the Empire of Ghana, which I want to talk about a little bit. Few places on earth are more desolate than the Sahara, the largest of the hot deserts, having taken on its present form on the 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. It became a formidable obstacle to human contact. It separated black inner Africa socially and culturally from its Mediterranean and Asian neighbors, while isolating the white northern quarter of the north of the desert from the great part of the continent to the south. Yet, the Sahara is not closed frontier. The few difficult but not impossible ways across it have acted as filters to human contact. They have always allowed small groups of dedicated traders, traveling scholars, and men of religion, as well as raiding warriors, to carry goods, ideas, influences, and warfare into across the desert. Historically, the North has been the more active mercantile, intellectual, and technological partner in limited two-way Saharan exchange system of sustained mutual benefit, and has usually dominated and exploited the South. It might be argued that there was no regular trans-Saharan trade system before the rise of the camel-mounted Berber nomads in the first Christian centuries. Before the first Arab invasion of North Africa in the 7th century, the Sahara was a passage only for infrequent trade on a continental, if not an intercontinental scale. The volume of trade was small and probably made little economic impact on either side of the desert. Apart from gold, inner African produced little that was wanted in the Mediterranean world or was worth carrying there. The trade was probably limited to some species of wild animals for the Roman circuses, chemical stones, drugs, and raw materials for food processing and perfume making, all valuable curiosities once they had crossed the desert. Trade in the river's north-south direction was inhibited by the relative poverty and thus limited purchasing power of Saharan communities and of Sudanic societies who lacked gold or surplus slaves for export. This economic imbalance between the north and the south of the desert was always to put certain constraint on this two-way business. So I want to highlight the fact that the agents of this change were, first of all, the newly mobile, as I said earlier, camel-mounted Berber nomads, who were in due course further motivated and inspired by the Islam introduced by North Africa's first wave of Arab invaders. Maybe. And first wave of Arab invaders, the lasting contact they made with the emerging black states of the Sudanic Sahel, notably ancient Ghana, meant that for the first time inner Africa found itself in permanent contact with the Mediterranean civilization. It was at last able to send regular supplies of two very desirable commodities, prime items for exchange to the new intercontinental caliphal empires of the Arabs, gold and black slave, as you can see over there. The great dynasties, I mean that of Ghana in the south and Almoravid in the north, emerged with the intensification of these exchanges. What results from the economic and the commercial growth of Al-Andalus, France, and the Italian peninsula. For the first time, the elite of the Ghana Empire converted to Islam, which gave its strength and currents in particular to attack and enslave populations located further south. Another expansionist entity, the Almoravids, made themselves the champions of Sunnism at a time when the Maghreb was not predominantly Sunni. It is a fact that both the Empire of Ghana and the Almoravids emerged from the same matrix. I mean, the wealth generated by the trans-Saharan trade. So we have an expansionist entity that extends south and another to the north. It is probably even this incapacity of the Almoravids to defeat the Empire of Ghana, which decided them to take the road of the north. The progress made by the climatic history recently highlighted that the 11th century corresponded to a very marked drying up of the Sahara. What to consider when talking about the Almoravids' conquest of the Maghreb and Al-Andalus. To summarize, luxury goods and manufactured goods from the north were traded from gold and slave from the south. And right now, I want to emphasize the key role of gold. It was delivered by long and complex means from the far-from gold fields of Bambouk and Bourré, which is right there. You see, well, let me see further. To the first of the great Sudanese states, the Empire of Ghana, which you can see right there, on the southwest desert fringes. The many medieval Arab accounts of the trans-Saharan gold traffics thus concentrate on the western roads to Morocco and the central Maghreb, and they took advantage of the golden wealth of ancient Ghana. In terms of the balance of payments, the Maghrebian merchants, and therefore indirectly the Berber dynasty, were the winners of these exchanges. For instance, with regard to the Empire of Ghana, gold sold in the form of gold dust or ingots was resold in the form of dinar struck in the Maghreb cities. The value of Almoravid dinar was such that they circulated all around the Mediterranean world, in Muslim and Christian lands alike, but also in the south part of the desert, in such a city as Ouderhoust, which you can see, right there. Today, Ouderhoust is considered a moment of glory in Mauritanian history. This is how excavation material appears on stamps. Much more important, the name of Ghana was given to a country which had little to do with medieval Ghana. The goal remains the same, to pretend that the history of African states does not begin with colonization. I'm not quite willing to say that the Almoravids caused the first crusade, but evidence shows that their control of the gold trade must have been a factor. During more than half century, the Muluk Tawa'if, the different kings of Al-Andalus, managed to survive by paying parias, tributes, in gold. Obviously, after the Almoravid victory over the king of Castile in 1086, there was no more tribute, and after all, the conquest of Al-Andalus. As a matter of fact, Alphonse VI was one of the main financial backers from the construction of the new Cluny Abbey, which was at that time the main abbey in the Western world. In the aftermath of the defeat of Alphonse VI, stopped funding these projects. As a result, Cluny Abbey spearheaded the First Crusade. There is another reason, specific to the Maghreb, why the arrival of gold and slaves proved to be decisive. The Maghreb does not follow the same historical trajectory and its Muslim neighbors. For the most part, the Maghreb was populated by extremely belligerent tribes, unwilling to submit or pay taxes. To make these populations pay tax on large scale, it was necessary to send militias. This is to say that it was expensive to make the subjects pay tax, sometimes more expensive than the expenses incurred with the sending of armed troops. That is, to a certain extent, the dynasties of the Maghreb depended on the revenue gathered from the caravan trade and from the trade practiced with the Italian city-states. It should be noted that the Almoravids, the first, signed an agreement with Pisa in 1143. Two catastrophes marked a turning point in that larger context. The capture of Ceuta in 1415 terminus of the trans-Saharan trade by the Portuguese. We understand that the day when the Portuguese settled on the Banc d'Arguin, which means not far from the Moroccan Bordeaux, which is right now in Mauritania, on the 1440, and captured part of the wealth of this caravans trade that constituted a catastrophe for the dynasties of the Maghreb. Never again the dynasties of the Maghreb would be able to compete with the European states. Only a power with significant means could build a war fleet, what became impossible in the 15th century due to lack of financial resources. However, the arrival of hundreds of thousands of slaves still brought about significant changes for the societies located on both sides of the Sahara. I'm going to quote later, maybe François-Xavier did it yesterday, but let me add something about them. I don't think I'm going to quote. François-Xavier did it yesterday, but this letter from the Almohad Chancellor highlights the importance of the trading of slaves between the Maghreb and the sub-Saharan Africa. This is illustrated by the fact that the Almohad governor of Sijil Messa was obliged to contact the king of Ghana in order to request the release of slave traders, Julep, while doing so hinting at measures of retaliation. Furthermore, it is evidence of the fact that it was not only God that interested the Maghrebian powers, but that the trading of slaves could be one of their concerns. This trade needs to be looked at in a broader context. Throughout the 11th and the 13th century, the time of the Berber Empire's relations between the Maghreb and sub-Saharan Africa were reinforced. The Almoravids, the ancient camel-driving nomads, which is today Mauritania, a long experience of pro-slavery society due to their plunged contact with black countries. When they returned to the north and brought the Maghreb and Al-Andalus together under their control, they took many black slaves with them. The slaves were bought in the large caravan city in the south of the Sahara by the Maghrebian merchants, who dealt with local middlemen, sometimes of several origins themselves, in order to channel them through the desert. It seems that the slave traders often adopted complex strategies, choosing slaves as representatives. In an extract concerning a family from Tlemcen, the Makaris, the writer from Grenade, Sendin al-Khatib, suggests that the representatives were often the children of these merchants with the black slaves. It is therefore likely that their bilingualism enabled them to deal easily with the African slave merchants. These slaves were brought together in large centers in the south of the Maghreb. For example, in the Almoravid fortress of Zagora, Tezegurt, before being sent all over the Maghreb by other vendors. Every city had its own specialized market. The civil workforce was large, and it seemed that many rural families had slaves. We must ask ourselves the question why the Maghreb dynasty, as well as society as a whole, constantly needed new slaves. It is necessary to return, on the one hand, to the power structure of the Maghrebian dynasties, and on the other, to the demography of North Africa. The anthropological and political background of the history of the Maghreb Middle Ages amounts to saying that the dynasty fought against very belligerent populations. These populations had never before been subjected to power outside their tribe. On a demographic level, it is necessary to underline a demographic weakness of the Maghreb, consequence of a system of production enabled to create a constant growth of the population, as was the case of feudal Europe. The population of the Maghreb stagnated around 6 million in the 12th century. Moreover, the population was constantly struck by substantial crises due to drought and epidemics. It is clear that the environmental conditions worsened during the Berber empires. This is probably the way North Africa gradually found itself from the 11th century in a position of strong servile demand. This is why sub-Saharan Africa could have become one of the privileged sources of supply. There were indeed slaves used in the development of the imperial gardens of Marrakesh or the development of tanneries or leather goods. The presence of slaves is attested for all commercial activities requiring labor in sufficient quantity, just as the tanneries of Armat in the south of Morocco, for instance. Thus, most of the men in charge of the trans-Saharan trade were most often of origin served. This can be seen from the fact that they were entrusted with position or of responsibility. In fact, some sources note that the position of governor of the town of Gersif under Almoravid control, or that of the great chamberlain of the palace under the Almohad Caliph al-Rashid, were given to these people of Tekruri ethnicity, as you can see right there. You see, Al-Hajj Tekruri al-Gnawi, which was a famous statesman of the Almoravids. I'm going to talk about a little bit about that further. For example, the first time that the term of Agnaw, which means the black, is at Agnaw, who gave after that Guinea, Gnawi, Gnawa, as you know, is attested in the memoir of the king of Grenade, Abdullah ibn Ziri, in the second half of the 11th centuries. There are two brothers who served as a military governor, Qaid, so at a very high level. It is a fact that the black slaves were from the Almoravid period integrated into the army and into a form of Praetorian Guard. Christian sources mention black troops in the service of the Almoravids and also the Almohad. Nonetheless, it remains unclear whether this is a figure of speech made to demonize the enemy or factual element. For example, in El Poema de mi Cid, which is very important in the history of literature, it is mentioned that the Almoravid army was also made up of black women throwing javelins. It should be noted that in the 1961 epic historical drama film, El Cid, directed by Anthony Mann and produced by Samuel Bronston, the hero, Charlton Heston, must face the bad Almoravids whose shields are inspired by the Revue Nègre. It is to say, the very important show of the 20s of the last century. It is to say that after Jiménez de Rada, which is the main Castilian character of the 30th century and the consular of the kings of Castile, are assimilated the Almoravids to the Africans, to the black. The history of the Berber Empire does not have iconographic resources which allow this history to be illustrated. However, we have the Cantigas de Santa Maria, produced for Alfonso the Wise in the 30th century. Indeed, Maribel Fierro taught us that what Alfonso the Wise owed to the Berber empires. She titled one of her articles, Alfonso the Wise, the last Almohad Caliph. This is why we can reasonably use the image of the Cantigas. And we can see that there are Muslim horsemen, knights, for fight and Christian on the front line. I selected from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, this famous book. It's a full useful picture. I mean, the main problem with the sources from North Africa and the rest of the Islamic world is that we have very few, as mentioned. As you can see, the black slaves have no turban, no hat or any kind, and they are bareheaded. That's a huge difference between the slaves and the free men. But you can see that one of the free men is black. He's from African origin, obviously, but you have to take into account that there is a member of the elite. He's riding a horse not far from the caliphate flag. The writing on the flag means powers, belongs to God. Al-mulku lillah. And the color red is also a symbol of the caliph. You can find two kinds of people of African origins with very different statuses. Regarding the power structure, the enlistment of slaves was essential. This is how Yusuf ibn Tashfin, so the first emir of the veiled people, I mean the Almoravids, first gesture to signify his power was to take 6,000 black slaves into his service. It was a way of asserting his power to his cousins. Foreigners were called upon to carry arms and reinforce the power of the Sultan. In such a configuration, they did not hesitate to entrust lots of powers to former slaves. Persons of several origin could exercise the highest responsibilities. During the siege of Oran by the Almohads in 1146, when the fortress was at the verge of being taken by the Almohads, and when the Almoravid ruler was who had entrenched himself there, Ibn Hidari, the famous chronicler, shed harsh light on the composition of the immediate entourage of the King of the Veiled, in relation of the exceptional event in the process of occurring, namely the downfall and death on the first of the Almoravid, Tashfin ibn Ali. The presence of the three most prominent figures in Tashfin entourage testified to the nature of his power and how it worked. There was a Fatah, a slave, whose name Sandal suggests that he was a man from sub-Saharan Africa, his several origins attaching him directly and personally to the prince. The fact that he accompanied his master on an expedition shows that his function was not limited to the confines of the palace. We also identify Bashir, identified function, and was the source indicate of Christian origin. He was probably one of those Mozarabic from the Guadix and Granada regions who had been deported to Morocco after 1126. Finally, the presence of Ibn Mazdali is reported in Tashfin entourage. He was the only member of his close entourage who was not a civil origin. Rather, he was the son of one of the most famous sheikh of the Lemtuna, known as Mazdali bin Tilgan, who had played a crucial role in Yusuf Tashfin's ascension to the throne before winning fame in Al-Andalus. The prince's entourage was made up both of figures of civil origin and of notable descendants of the most prominent figures of the early political military movement. Unlike other regions of the Islamic world, the various powers in place in the Maghreb, starting with the Almoravids and the Almohads, never cut ties with their original lineage, in particular by continuing to promote men of that same lineage. This is a fundamental fact, often insufficiently taken into account, namely that the original esprit de corps, the Asabiya, linked to state power will never totally disintegrate. In this sense, we can say that the model proposed by Ibn Khaldun is false. Indeed, it does not apply to the Almoravids and the Almohad dynasties. I must add that we do not identify there a disappearance of the esprit de corps, so-called esprit de corps, so important in this thought, or more exactly in this way of thinking. It is for this reason that slaves or people of several origins could not achieve the function of sultan or emir in the Maghreb. The massive arrival of slaves only partially changed the situation. The partly civil dimension of any power in the Maghreb was already a fact at the beginning of the 12th century. In the fight against the Almoravids, one of the first expeditions led by the Almohads via the fortress of Zagora, the aim was to capture as many slaves as possible. The acquisition of slaves was at this point considered to be strategic. One of the first expeditions led by the Almohads against the Almoravids was directed to this purpose at the fortress of Zagora. The slaves that were not freed, but they were integrated into the Almohad hierarchy, in the category of slaves of the state's property, Abid al-Makhzan, whose role is obscure even though they can be found throughout the history of this dynasty. They were then included in the Almohad hierarchy. In short, there could be no seizure of power without the inclusion of black soldiers or servants. The power of dynasty was measured by the number of slaves possessed by the Sultan, which is a characteristic shared by the dynasties on both sides of the Sahara. For instance, the king of Mali of the beginning of the 40th century, Mansa Musa, is mentioned in Arab sources as a very powerful king because he owned more than 12,000 slaves. As a result, all of the great chamberlains, Hajib, Hujjab, of the Maghrebian dynasties were black. They had control over the affairs of the palace, and they were supervised by a chief of slaves, Sheikh al-Abid, who managed to the slaves of the caliph's house. In their service to the sovereign, they reached public position of responsibility without, however, having control of the main state figures, as did many slaves in the Fatimid and Ottoman empires. And there is no trace in the history of the Maghreb of slaves governing states, like the Slavic emirs in Al-Andalus, Saqalib, or the Mamluk in Egypt. This can be explained by the fact that the Maghreb state was built upon a tribal society which could not and did not want to recognize outsiders, slaves, or former black slaves as sovereigns or even as leaders. This is also stemmed from the fact that this society, unlike Egypt, had recently become states, and the reigning dynasties did not want to, or not could, they impose a monopoly of violence on their subject. Anyway, the Sheikh of slaves was well known, high figure who many have been in charge of leading the capital, Marrakesh. The possession of slaves, as well as the fact of systematically traveling on horseback or having enough reserve to survive periods of famine, was an attribute of the elite. The distinction between the elite and the subjects, Ra'iyya, was made in relation to the number of slaves possessed. No dignitary could show himself in public without his slaves. I will use the extract from the rare chronicles written in the 15th century, Riyad al-Atun fi Akhbar Miknesset Zitoun. It gives a list of the various constituents of the Golden Age, which the Berber empires represented afterwards. Al-Qasim, the son, was appointed Qadi, which means judge, in the regions of the Maghreb and Granada. But he left Fink Post to devote himself to agriculture and in this country of Taura, not far from Meknes. And he entered in the year more or less the beginning of the 12th century. The people of Taura came in large number to welcome him. They were accompanied by blacks called slaves of the holy house, Abid al-Hurma. These black men were playing with iron spears, dancing and singing. Their wives played all kinds of musical instruments while singing, accompanied by a horn player, Buk. These reprehensible manifestations were part of their customs during their celebration. End of the quote. Furthermore, legal consultations of anecdotes presented in the hagiographic corpus teach us that black slaves were often put in charge of entertainment for celebrations, weddings, circumcisions, burials, and so forth, singing, dancing, and playing music. This explains how, as can be seen in a list drawn up by Al-Shaqundi in the 30th century, certain of the musical instruments used in the Maghreb had names that had been borrowed from African languages, especially Songhai, such as the dub-dub, a large drum. Conversely, Maghrebian influences were a source of resentment in sub-Sahara kingdoms. Arab geographers and travelers who went to the south of the Sahara reported that the elite in Ghana, Mali, and Takrur had adopted the Maghrebian dress style. According to Ibn Battuta, This is particularly the case with the way of putting the turban under the chin, tahannuq. The elite in Mali dressed like this from a Maghrebian model, obviously. The black slaves were sold to work in the fields or to shepherd livestock, also to be found carrying out domestic chores. They baked bread, fetched water, or prepared meals. The employment of black slaves in kitchens led to the spread of new recipes and way of preparing food originating in sub-Saharan regions, such as the steaming of cereals, which spread in Berber cuisine, where boiled food had been predominantly used. In the only two recipe books that have been preserved, the invention of recipes is attributed to slaves. Al-Bakri tells us of the specific culinary skills of black slave women in Oudaroust, who prepare juz naqat, sugar almonds, and qata'if, donuts, if you want. This woman is said sold for 100 mataqil, which is a lot of money. That information is repeated by Almohad official Ibn Abd Rabbi. He had to the list of delicacies that this woman prepared: loz naqat, almond cakes; qahriyat, comestibles from Cairo; kunafat, semolina with honey and butter; and mushaddat, thin layered pastry. It's very interesting because these recipes have Abbasid and Iraqi origins. However, they are found prepared by women slaves in the kitchens of Oudaroust and the Almoravid and Almohad palaces. In addition, we found the states of black cooks also in rural and Berber society in the Maghreb. A significant member languages, along with some of their neighbors, refer to the 5 daily prayers of Islam using words that cannot be derived from their usual Arabic names. Most of them are internal formations. Comparable forms which have attract less common are also found in a number of West African languages, notably Soninke and Songhai, the languages of the first major Saharan states to come into direct contact with Islam, as well as their neighbor to the south, such as Mandinga and Pular. As the French linguist Lamine Swag points out, the prayer names in these languages would be loanwords from Berber and not from Arabic. Let me talk. Maybe I have 5 minutes maybe to talk. Yes. Okay, thank you. I'll talk a little bit about the entrepreneur of slaves. First, I ask myself the question, what were black slaves called in medieval Maghreb? It can be said that 2 terms were the most commonly used. The most common referred especially to blacks from West Africa was the term Ignawin in Berber and Gnawa in vernacular Arabic. As we have said, the Berber king of Granada was the first to use it in writing in the Berber from Tegnaut. We find it against in the 12th century use by the geographer Al-Zuhri, used in plural and Arabized from Gnawa, when he describes the inhabitants of the capital of Ghana. The Almohad official Ibn Qattan refers to the black militia of the city of Aramat as being Gnawa, just as we identify members of the entourage of Ibn Tumat known as Gnawi. It should also be remembered that the door of the Almohad Palace in Marrakesh was called Baba Gnaw. In the state of our knowledge, we do not know exactly if there is a term of African origin or Berber term. It remains clear that in Berber it means the black and the mute, that is to say, the one who is unable to speak the language of the country, which was the Berber. I think this term is actually a word of Berber origin. In Tuareg, which is the most conservative of Berber languages, they speak of the land of the black as Akel Nignewin, which is Subsequently, the Portuguese were dependent on Maghreb expertise to discover Africa, so from the 1450s, they used again the term Gnawa to designate West Africa. There is nevertheless a major difference, where the Berber language refers to an Ignawan people, or Africans. The Portuguese first refer to a land, to a toponym, Guinea. I have to say, this is also the case with the word Senegal, which comes from the name of the Berber tribes Znega, Isnegen in Berber, as you can say. In the raw Berber sources for medieval times, the term most often used is Ismgan, which means both slave and black. This term is always used in the plural form because it refers to a different group, that is to say, those which do not relate to a tribe and therefore to a genealogy, nasab. Slaves were often given a name with a positive connotation, much as Mimoun, good fortune, Izr in Berber, or Masrud in Arabic, which means exactly the same. Joy, or musk, Raihan, myrtle. The explanation of this practice is attributed by sources to the fact that the first act of the day was to call for one slave. Saying a pretty name was considered to be a good omen. The onomastic system, therefore, distinguished slaves from the rest of the population. They had no specific names, ism, no indication of ethnicity, nisba, and their heritage was not mentioned, with the particle ibn in Arabic or u in Berber. Because their several status was proof of the indignity of their African heritage, that is why they could not bear the names of their fathers, and their geographic origins was only rarely specified. One exception to this is Tekrur, modern Senegal, more or less. Because it seems that people coming from this kingdom played an important role as the public officials in the Maghreban dynasties, although nobody can determine why this was. This can be seen from the fact that they were entrusted with positions of responsibility. In fact, sources note that the position of governor of the town of Gersif, the eastern part of Morocco, under Almoravid control, or that of great chamberlain of the palace under Caliph Rashid, were given to these people of Tekruri ethnicity. Finally, two brothers could have the same name, like the two Mimun, early supporters of Ibn Tomart, the founder of the Almohad dynasty. This is proof of the indistinguishability of the Maghreb society. It seems that other companions of Mehdi ibn Tomart were also of African origin, like Abu Muhammad Wasnar, Aghwal, which means in Berber the dark-skinned man, and Iburaki Simgan, which means naming both on a different plant and slaves in Berber. Messianism. I don't have any time. It's finished. So let me go to the conclusion further. We have seen that one thing that I want to point out is the way of saying Gnawa and also Takrur was made in the Berber way of writing Arabic, using the Arabic graphic, you see. For instance, right there, you can see Takruri with a kaf, with a shidda, and also sukun, which means it's a phoneme only used in Berber. It's between kaf and kaf. We don't use it anymore, but the tribe used to say to use it under these days. And it's also the same with right there with Gnawa, Gnawi. It's a jim, and you can see over there the kaf and the shidda, which means it's not a jim. We can say Jnawi, obviously. You used to say Ignawi, or Ignawan, like this. We have seen that this period was characterized by an intensification of exchanges between the two banks of the Sahara. What was without doubt at the origin of the the rise of the Berber empires as major players on the international scene, especially the massive arrival of the black slaves had a very strong impact on the societies of the Maghreb, even if the lack of adequate sources, it remained difficult to discern. I mentioned in the introduction how important the end of the historical anonymity of West Africa was. It is obviously no coincidence that the first to have written a book devoted to the description de l'Afrique, Description de l'Africa, was a person, Lo Africanus, who grew up in Fez and was a captive in Italy. His book, Descrizione dell'Africa, was regarded among his scholarly peers in Europe as the most authoritative treatise on the subject until the modern exploration of Africa. There is a still more extraordinary, which is quite unbelievable. There is the story of Estebanico, Little Stephen. He was an Arabized black, and he was sold in the Portuguese-controlled Moroccan town of Azamor, which was a very important port at this time. I must say that the Portuguese also practiced slavery on large scale. So about Estebanico, the Moor from Azamor, he was acquired as a servant by a Spanish nobleman, Andrés Dorantes de Carranza. After landing in Florida with the Narvaez expedition, he was one of the 4 survivors of this expedition. It is clear that the Moroccan background helped him to adapt to the native Indian societies. He was the first non-native Indian to travel to what is now Texas and Arizona. I was talking about the eagerness to go to modern history, and I maybe also suffer from this defect. Nonetheless, I find it incredible that a man was the fruit of these close relations between the Maghreb and Bilad Sudan was the first to discover Texas and Arizona. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating and very interesting lecture. And we have 5 minutes for a number of comments, questions. Yes?
Thank you very much for that broad survey and deep survey. So I found it very interesting, the story of the soldiers functioning in Northern Africa. And it made me think of the Sudan infantry in the Fatimid army. That is a key part of the Fatimid army, and it gives Salah ad-Din a very difficult time when he's trying to take over. In the end, he massacres them. So I never thought about this before. I never thought too much about the origins of where these Sudanese came from. But I wonder if they come from that area, the area you've been discussing, all the way on the west of Africa, go up to the Maghreb, then move across, or some other way? Or do you have any other thoughts about where these Fatimid Sudanese soldiers came from?
Thank you so much for the question. I don't know exactly where they came, but allegedly we can assume that they came from the Bilad Sudan, I mean the western part, because they used all the Maghrebian dynasties, I mean all the Fatimids first, and after that the Almoravids and the Almohads used a significant number of soldiers from which is right now more or less Mali, Senegal, and so forth. So we can assume that for the Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, it was exactly the same, because for him, the Maghreb was the example, a successful example of one Muslim power which achieved to struggle against the Christians and against all his enemies. So I don't know. I don't have the proof, obviously, but and what I told you yesterday was the fact that there is a huge difference between the mercenaries who came from the peninsula, Spain Peninsula. They used to call them Ifurkhan, which is the Arabic word to say boys. They still, just like the Jouvenes, as Georges Duby talked about. I mean, knights were under the age, were not adults. They're not adults by the age. They're not adults because they're not Muslims. But there is Yitzhaq Hen on one hand, and on the other hand we have the blacks and the Habit, which is different. Sorry. Okay.
Any other question? Yes, Sarah, please.
Thank you for this very rich lecture. If I understood you correctly, thank you for this very rich lecture. If I understood you correctly, you said, en passant, that the Almoravids turned north because they couldn't conquer the empire of Ghana. As you know, both medieval sources and modern historiography often present the crossing of the straits by the Berbers, both Almohads and Almoravids, as almost doing a favor. They were asked to come there. They do a favor to the Spaniards, to the Andalusian, they moved. And I would very much like to hear you say another sentence or two about the difference between looking from the south-north and looking from the north-south, about the push and the pull.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. Because on the Andalusian, for the people of Al-Andalus, there is both. It's extremely complicated. For them, it's no doubt, it's catastrophe. Meanwhile, they save them. So, but you have to take into account too, it's not well known, but we have a Almoravid dynasty in the Mauritania, in Tagant, till the 17th century. So there was an attempt, there is a try to go back to the south. It's not only in the north direction, as I mentioned earlier. So there are two different waves of conquest of Al-Andalus. The first one is 1086. They were called, and then it doesn't work so well. It means after the victory of Sagrajas, the kings of the Al-Andalus used to see them as a threat, as a threat, which means there is no other option for them. And the king of Seville used to say, the choice is between to serve as a shepherd of porks or shepherds of the camels. This is what he said. Obviously, the porks, it means the Christians on one hand, and on the other hand, the camels, it means the Almoravids. So it means for them, this is the end, and there is no other options. So after that, we have to take into account that for most of the Spaniard scholars since the 19th century, the conquest of Al-Andalus by the Almoravids was a true catastrophe. Not only the conquest of Al-Andalus by the Arabs at the very beginning of the 8th century, but the Almoravids were the barbarians, savages, and so on. So there is that kind of bad reputation, which is to say that until right now, it's quite difficult to say what they done exactly in Al-Andalus as a legacy, as an architectural legacy. There is a lot of Almoravid legacy in Al-Andalus, but it was not so well known. So this is the fact. Thank you.
I will permit myself a very short question. I have read once in Abd al-Wahid al-Marrakushi, in his history, a sentence that I don't understand, but you may be able to explain to me. He says, he describes the doctrines of Ibn Tumart. He said that in doctrine he's familiar, he's close to the Ash'ari except for the divine attributes, in which he is close to Mu'tazila. Then he gives a sentence, the following sentence. He says, وَكَانَ يُبْطِنُ شَيْئًا مِنَ التَّشَيُّعِ غَيْرَ أَنَّهُ لَمْ يُظْهِرْ مِنْهُ إِلَى الْعَامَّةِ بِشَيْءٍ. It means he maintained discreetly some Shia beliefs, but nothing of this he revealed to the mass. Is it true that there is Shia elements in his doctrine?
You know, the Almohads were the losers of the history, because after the aftermath of the fall, take or the seizure of Marrakesh in 1269, the Almohad doctrine was like a heretical belief. So we have a huge number of opponents. One of them is Wahel Murakushi, because he was in Egypt when he wrote his piece, Al-Mu'jib. And so to point out that there is some kind of messianism, Shirism in his doctrine, it's kind to...
Just to blame them.
To blame them, definitely. So we don't know exactly, because they used to say that the Almohad believe, maybe Dr. Stroumsa knows it better than I, but it's a mix. It's not a doctrine, it's not a belief, by the way, for them. It's only a mix between Mu'tazilism, Harism, and Shirism. So it's doubtful for me. There is a huge doubt about that.
Thank you.
I want to say.